The studio lights cast a soft glow across Jasmine Crockett's face as the cameras rolled. Seated across from a seasoned political anchor, she looked poised, deliberate. She was known for being sharp, unflinching, and unusually well-prepared. For a lawmaker of her generation, the conversation had already covered rising voter concerns and judicial overreach when the anchor asked a question that, until then, had only been lightly danced around on air. Do you believe personal conduct from former administration officials should still be under public scrutiny? Then she said calmly and clearly, if it intersects with national security, yes, absolutely. What followed wasn't a political jab. It was a layered disclosure that no one in the room or watching at home expected. She began by stating that over the past year, her team had quietly reviewed a number of declassified records and financial disclosures, specifically from the Trump administration. Much of the data was routine. She explained hotel logs, visitor entries, travel manifests. That's where the questions started, and eventually the answers emerged. What Crockett described were two meetings in two different countries with two different foreign nationals who had close business ties to Trump Organization projects abroad. But the key figure in both, she claimed, wasn't Donald Trump. It was Melania. According to Crockett, both individuals met with her in what were described as personal settings, unrecorded in official itineraries and absent from secret. Service travelogues. The first meeting allegedly took place in the fall of 2018 in Monaco, following a high-profile fashion event that Melania had attended unofficially. Crockett said documents showed a private dinner closed to press and political staff with a European billionaire who had once donated heavily to a Dubai-based Trump-branded property. The second meeting, she claimed, occurred in late 2019 at a Manhattan hotel under a pseudonym reservation. The guest list for that meeting, which Crockett said was confirmed through cross-verified security entries, included a South American developer known to be under investigation for financial manipulation. Related to Trump real estate partnerships, she didn't deliver the details with flair. There were no shouted accusations or smug smiles. It was the restraint that made it so jarring. Crockett emphasized the concern wasn't about Melania's personal life in isolation. It was about access, privilege, and what these meetings may have influenced. She wasn't just the First Lady. She was an ambassador of proximity to the presidency, Crockett said, and when people paid to be near her, they weren't buying charm. They were buying leverage. Donald Trump's name came up quickly. In the conversation that followed, Crockett pointed out that both men had seen direct benefit through foreign licensing agreements tied to the Trump brand agreements, which until now had never been publicly linked to Melania's travel schedule. Crockett didn't say Melania had brokered the deals. She didn't need to. She simply pointed to what appeared to be an undeniable sequence of access, meetings, and outcomes. The implication was devastating. Even if nothing illegal occurred, the optics suggested Melania may have operated within a gray area, using the public platform of First Lady to sustain personal or familial financial relationships. For Trump, who had long insisted his wife was kept out of politics, and above all of it, this struck a deep blow. Crockett reminded viewers that Trump's defense had always hinged on compartmentalization. Business was business. Politics was politics. Family was private. But the records Crockett laid out suggested those lines had blurred. Journalists began live-tweeting the segment before it was over. Screenshots of Crockett's notes and her careful phrasing were already circulating. Analysts watching the clip called it controlled detonation. By the time the segment ended, producers were already requesting the source material from her office. This wasn't a political takedown driven by spectacle. It was a methodical exposure, sharpened by preparation and executed with surgical intent. Crockett didn't need to embellish. She just needed to connect the dots. And she did, all while keeping her tone measured and her language grounded. In policy relevance, the country and Donald Trump had just been handed a new kind of scandal, one that didn't burn hot, but cold and quiet, like a paper trail finally catching fire. The room at Mar-a-Lago had been unusually quiet that afternoon. Melania Trump, typically private and reserved, was sitting in the sunlit lounge with a few trusted aides, watching the live broadcast in silence. The television had been tuned to The political roundtable out of routine. No one in the room anticipated that the segment would become anything more than the usual partisan noise. But when Jasmine Crockett leaned into the camera and began speaking with unnerving clarity, the atmosphere changed immediately. Melania's expression didn't shift at first, not during the first few moments when Crockett mentioned the discrepancies in travelogues or the suspicious overlaps with international figures. It wasn't until the Congresswoman named one of the men involved, a figure Melania had once met during a private donor dinner in Monaco, that her grip on the armrest tightened. According to one staff member who later relayed the events anonymously, Melania stood up abruptly, walked a few paces toward the screen, then collapsed to the floor. The staff moved quickly. Aides shouted for help, and a private on-site medic was called to assess her. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Initial reports suggested she had fainted, possibly from shock, stress, or a drop in blood pressure, but no formal medical statement was released. Within the hour, the story of her collapse began leaking, first to tabloid outlets, then to mainstream press. Melania, who had spent years keeping herself at a careful distance from the political fray, was suddenly at the center of a crisis she could no longer ignore. Donald Trump was in another wing of the estate when the incident occurred. According to two people present, he was meeting with legal advisors, reviewing civil trial strategies, when he was interrupted. He reportedly rushed to Melania's side, visibly shaken but focused. One source described him as livid, not at her, but at whoever caused this, when he was told that it was a broadcast from Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett that triggered the collapse. He demanded a copy of the footage and left the room without saying a word. Melania had always maintained a controlled presence. She rarely spoke out publicly, choosing instead to let her silence speak louder than any statement. But those who knew her well said she was under increasing pressure, not just from the media or the public, but from the shifting legal landscape surrounding her husband. As Donald Trump faced mounting legal scrutiny and financial investigations, Melania had largely remained out of the spotlight. Crockett's revelations changed that overnight. The former First Lady's collapse wasn't just a physical response, it symbolized a breaking point. Inside sources described her as withdrawn in the hours that followed, refusing to speak to anyone beyond her physician and one longtime friend. The public didn't see her for the next several days, which only fueled speculation about the emotional toll the revelations had taken on her. Media outlets replayed the footage of Crockett's segment in a continuous loop, with expert panels analyzing every word, every claim, every timeline. For Trump, the implications went beyond personal embarrassment. He had long insisted that Melania remained uninvolved in any of the Trump organization's dealings during his presidency. Her public image as an aloof and apolitical First Lady had helped buffer the family from deeper scrutiny. But Crockett's disclosures suggested otherwise, that Melania's private meetings with foreign nationals, held discreetly and undocumented, may have intersected with Trump-affiliated financial ventures. That possibility put the entire Trump defense strategy at risk. Political strategists quickly realized how fragile the situation was. Trump's inner circle tried to dismiss Crockett's claims as politically motivated, but they lacked the usual energy. No one had expected the Congresswoman to come armed with such granular detail, dates, locations, patterns. It didn't read like character assassination. It read like the first steps in a prosecutorial narrative. The fact that Melania collapsed upon hearing it added a visceral element that headlines couldn't resist. It wasn't just news, it was now an unfolding crisis. By evening, Mar-a-Lago had entered lockdown mode. Staff were instructed not to speak to media, and security was tightened around the residence. Trump himself made no immediate public comment, but insiders said he was deeply rattled. He had dealt with legal attacks, political betrayals, and media firestorms. But this was different. This time, it wasn't about him alone. It was his wife, her name, her health, her decisions, that had become the flashpoint. And it had. All begun with a controlled sentence, delivered on live television by a lawmaker who didn't raise her voice or flinch. Within hours of Jasmine Crockett's live TV interview, the clip had already been dissected, subtitled, and shared across every major social media platform. What began as a moment of tense television quickly transformed into a focal point for journalists, watchdog groups, and legal analysts. The reason wasn't just the content, it was the delivery. Crockett didn't appear vengeful or theatrical. She appeared ready, composed, and informed. And that, more than anything, triggered a sense of legitimacy among observers who had spent years dismissing stories around Melania Trump as tabloid fodder. Crockett's accusations had weight because they weren't accusations in the usual political sense. They came with documentation timelines, matching travel records, security reports. She hadn't accused Melania of adultery or personal misjudgment in a salacious way. Instead, she posed a professional concern. If the First Lady of the United States was meeting privately with foreign businessmen tied to Trump Organization ventures without official oversight or logs, what were the implications for national security? Legal commentators were among the first to react seriously. The story quickly drew comparisons to past investigations of public officials whose private meetings led to compromised deals or conflicts of interest. But what made this different was that the figure at the center, Melania Trump, had always existed just outside the perimeter of accountability. She wasn't elected, she didn't have formal diplomatic responsibilities, and yet, by virtue of her position and access, she had proximity to some of the most sensitive decision-making spaces in the world. As more clips of Crockett segments circulated, a parallel track of investigation kicked off among journalists. Major networks began quietly assigning researchers to dig into Melania's international travel during her White House years. Financial reporters began cross-referencing foreign investment patterns tied to Trump properties. What they found was enough to warrant headlines: a surprising uptick in offshore commitments following events where Melania had made private appearances, all under the radar of official government transparency channels. For the Trump family, this was an unexpected and uniquely difficult situation. Unlike Donald Trump, who had spent years navigating accusations and investigations, Melania had built a brand on mystique and distance. She didn't appear in depositions. She didn't hold press conferences. Her silence was her armor. Now, however, that silence was being interpreted as avoidance, or worse, concealment. Trump's legal team scrambled to assess whether any formal laws had been breached. Could private, undocumented meetings held by the First Lady be framed as a national security risk? Could these interactions, if tied to Trump Organization financial gains, be used as evidence of a quid pro quo system within the administration? The possibility that Melania's personal connections might have enhanced her husband's business dealings created a deeply uncomfortable nexus between ethics, legality, and image. The fact that Crockett had chosen a live platform, a national broadcast with millions of viewers, amplified the seriousness. This wasn't a leak. It wasn't buried in court documents or whispered in backrooms. It was said out loud, on the record, with full awareness of the consequences. It forced media outlets that normally avoided stories about Melania's personal life to reevaluate their coverage. The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and even some conservative outlets began referring to Crockett's claims as worthy of congressional review. Behind closed doors, Republican lawmakers were caught off guard. Many had spent the past few months focused on shielding Donald Trump from mounting legal exposure. Few, if any, had anticipated that Melania would become a focal point of that defense strategy. Her image as a reluctant public figure was now being challenged by a counter-image, one of deliberate, private engagement in high-stakes environments. And if Crockett's documents continued to hold up under scrutiny, it wouldn't just be bad optics. It could redefine how much influence Melania had actually wielded. The broader implications stretched into the 2024 political landscape. Trump was preparing for another campaign run, and his team had been carefully curating his inner circle's image. Melania was supposed to reappear at key rallies, lending a softer visual to a campaign often marred by aggression and controversy. But now, the question hanging over her was no longer about appearance, it was about accountability. And every network, journalist, and political strategist knew that this story had only just begun to When Jasmine Crockett delivered her statements on live television, they didn't land like a personal attack, they landed like a chess move. Political aides began making phone calls, and senior Republicans were blindsided. For years, Melania Trump had been treated as a non-combatant in the political wars, someone seen as distant, even disinterested, in her husband's controversies. But now, she was positioned at the center of a growing firestorm, and the Republican Party didn't have a plan for that. Asterisk, the days following Crockett's interview revealed just how unprepared GOP leadership truly was. No coordinated response was issued. No senior figure stepped forward to defend Melania with evidence or clarity. Even Donald Trump, known for his immediate and often bombastic reactions, chose silence at first. Behind the scenes, however, pressure was mounting. Congressional Republicans, especially those facing tough re-elections, were frustrated. Some privately questioned why the former First Lady had allegedly been meeting with individuals who would now force them into damage control mode. Asterisk, the Republican Party had spent years constructing a narrative that separated Trump's political decisions from his personal and financial entanglements. This compartmentalization had helped shield them from fallout during his presidency, especially during impeachment proceedings and civil litigation. But Crockett's revelations put a crack in that defense. If Melania had knowingly engaged in private meetings with foreign businessmen connected to Trump Organization projects, then that compartment no longer held. It suggested not just blurred lines, but potential coordination. Asterisk, the concern among Republican strategists was that Crockett, a sitting Congresswoman, wouldn't risk making these statements without confidence in the underlying evidence. Her use of specific dates, documented names, and an unemotional tone gave her credibility that was difficult to undercut. It wasn't framed as gossip or conjecture, it was framed as a question of ethical oversight. And even those inside the GOP who remained loyal to Trump privately admitted that this was the kind of story that could pierce through the noise. Asterisk, Republican operatives began to worry about the long-term implications. If Melania was eventually called to testify, or worse, subpoenaed in relation to foreign contact or financial gain, it would destroy the image of her as apolitical. More dangerously, it could extend scrutiny into Trump's inner circle in ways that had previously been out of reach. Several members of the party's legal advisory teams raised alarms about the precedent this could set. If Melania's actions could be linked to benefits received by the Trump Organization during or after the presidency, that would invite investigations not only into financial impropriety, but into corruption and abuse of power. Asterisk, efforts were made behind closed doors to coordinate talking points. A few Trump loyalists in the House began floating counterclaims on social media, attempting to discredit Crockett as politically thirsty or seeking headlines. But these attempts lacked traction, mostly because Crockett herself refused. To feed the media machine, her silence, measured and strategic, allowed the gravity of her claims to linger without dilution. Asterisk, for Trump himself. The impact was personal and political. Internally, he raged at what he saw as betrayal, not by Melania, but by a system he believed was again conspiring against him. But allies close to him said that, for the first time, there was fear. Fear that questions about Melania's role would expose private records and communications they had fought hard to keep buried. And perhaps most importantly, GOP donors began asking for clarity. They wanted reassurance that Melania's name would not become a recurring headline in an election year already burdened with legal challenges. The absence of answers only deepened their anxiety. Fundraisers reported a subtle shift in tone. Cautious optimism gave way to guarded calculation. Asterisk, by the end of the week, the party's silence on the issue became its loudest signal. It was clear they didn't know how to manage this, not because they lacked messaging tools, but because they didn't expect to ever need them for Melania. She had always been off limits, until Jasmine Crockett changed that. And now, a party, already strained under the weight of legal uncertainty, found itself stumbling through a new narrative, one they never planned to defend. As the dust settled in the days following Jasmine Crockett's televised revelation, one thing became clear. A line had been crossed, not by Crockett. Melania Trump was treated as politically untouchable. Her public distance from the chaos of Donald Trump's presidency had served as both a shield and a strategy. But Crockett's disclosures pulled that curtain back, not to vilify, but to question how influence moves quietly through the corridors of power, even through those who claim to stay above the fray. Asterisk, the political fallout wasn't explosive. It was corrosive. Quietly, Republican operatives began revisiting their talking points. Donors grew anxious about the growing web of complications surrounding the Trump name. with a tone not of sympathy, but scrutiny. What made this moment so significant wasn't the collapse, the headlines, or even the shocking nature of the claims. It was the shift in perception. For the first time, Melania wasn't simply the elegant bystander. She was part of the political equation. Jasmine Crockett never framed her exposure as a personal attack. That's what made it land so effectively. Her argument was rooted in oversight, not outrage. Her tone was legal, not emotional noise. In the public eye, she wasn't just exposing Melania, she was reminding America how power operates behind closed doors. Through meetings without logs, through names that appear only in footnotes, and through people the public was never supposed to question. For Donald Trump, this marked a troubling new chapter. His legal strategy, political branding, and media posture had all relied on a sense of containment. He could take the heat he always had, but expanding that fire to include Melania shattered that illusion of separation. If she became a subject of investigation, then the Trump legacy faced a whole new level of vulnerability. Not just because of what Melania may have done or who she met, but because the public, and now the press, had started asking questions. They had once considered off-limits. The true impact of Crockett's revelations will unfold not in viral clips or trending hashtags, but in subpoenas, closed-door briefings, and silent recalculations among those who once stood firmly behind the Trump family. The shock wasn't in the drama, it was in the precision. And as more details are verified, as more records are traced, it may not be Melania's silence that protects her anymore. It will be what the paper trail says, or doesn't say, and, in Washington, what you can't explain